Okay, so pornography. It definitely gets people talking, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
You hear such strong feelings really all over the map. Casual interest sometimes, but also, really strong disapproval.
Mm-hmm.
Today, we're not really getting into whether it's good or bad overall.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, we want to do a deep dive into why some people oppose it.
Mm.
What are the core reasons behind that opposition?
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we've looked at quite a range of sources. Academic work that dissects the arguments, religious texts that lay out moral frameworks, and key feminist writings, too.
Right.
Our goal is really to understand the heart of the opposition. What are their main arguments? What are the different viewpoints? And, where do they overlap or diverge?
Okay, let's unpack this. Right off the bat, it seems like even agreeing on what pornography is can be tough.
Definitely.
Our sources show that term isn't simple. Lots of people make a clear distinction between, say, pornography and erotica. What's the difference people usually point to? Is it about intent or power dynamics or...
Yeah, that's a really crucial point to start with. The distinctions people draw often hinge on, well, perceived intent. Is the main goal just arousal? Or is there maybe an artistic aim? Or an exploration of sexuality that's seen as less exploitative?
Okay.
Power dynamics are definitely another big one. Erotica is often framed as more equal, whereas pornography gets criticized sometimes for depicting dominance in ways that might mirror or even reinforce societal inequalities.
I see.
But honestly, that line can be pretty blurry, very subjective.
Yeah.
What's clear, though, is that the opposition isn't just one big groupthink.
Right.
Some object to basically any explicit sexual content, period. Others are more focused on specific types they see as harmful, like anything involving violence, or obviously the exploitation of children.
And you get some strange alliances in the anti-porn movement, don't you?
You really do. It's fascinating. You've got social conservatives working alongside, say, harm reduction advocates. Their underlying reasons might be totally different, but they find common ground in their concerns.
Yeah, that is interesting. And speaking of how people feel, public opinion seems to be shifting, or at least it was in recent years. We saw that 2018 Gallup survey finding 33% of U.S. adults thought pornography was morally acceptable. That was a, 7% jump from just 2017?
That's right, a noticeable jump in just 1 year. But if you look longer term, that rise in perceived acceptability doesn't quite capture the whole picture.
Okay.
The data also shows this widening gap between men and women's views, going way back to 1975. Women have pretty consistently been more opposed than men.
Yeah.
And maybe even more telling, men's opposition has dropped off faster over that time. So that divergence really suggests gender plays a big role in how pornography is seen, through different societal or personal filters.
That difference between men and women. Maybe that hints at some of the deeper values or moral ideas at play.
Could be. Let's maybe dig into how religion shapes some of those perspectives.
Okay. So yeah, moving to specific viewpoints, religion is clearly a huge factor for a lot of people. Our sources suggest most major world religions have stances against pornography, even if the exact reasons differ a bit.
Yes, and those religious objections often come from really core beliefs about, well, human nature, the purpose of sex.
Right.
In many faiths, the body is seen as sacred, almost like a temple. And sexuality is often tied to procreation, usually within marriage. So from that viewpoint, pornography can look like a desecration of that sacredness. It reduces people to objects of lust, which just fundamentally clashes with their understanding of human worth and, the intended purpose of sex.
And there are specific scriptural references too, right? Like in Christianity.
Definitely. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verse 28, is cited a lot, where looking at someone lustfully is basically equated with adultery in the heart.
Wow, okay.
So that suggests that even the internal thought, the desire itself, is seen as morally significant. It's not just about the outward action.
And Catholicism has a very clear position too.
Extremely clear. The Catechism explicitly condemns pornography. It says it offends against chastity and does grave injury to the dignity of its participants.
Grave injury.
Yeah. It argues pornography twists the meaning of sexuality, reduces people to just, tools for selfish pleasure or profit, and that fundamentally undermines their dignity as humans made in God's image.
It's not only Christian faiths, though. Islam also has objections.
Correct. Islam puts a strong emphasis on modesty. and prohibits things that could lead to sex outside of marriage, like adultery.
Hmm.
There are verses in the Quran interpreted as condemning looking at others lustfully. Quran 24.31, for example, tells believing men to restrain their eyes and guard their private parts.
Okay.
And that's often taken to mean avoiding stuff, like depictions that could stir up impure thoughts or desires. So yeah, across these major religions, you see this consistent concern about sexual ethics, objectification, the sanctity of marriage, all feeding into the opposition.
Okay, let's shift gears quite a bit now because the feminist perspectives on this are, well, they're really varied, sometimes totally opposed to each other.
They really are. It's complex.
One major feminist argument is that the industry itself exploits women in how pornography is actually made. They point to allegations of coercion, abuse, unsafe conditions.
Right. And what's really key there is how that feminist critique links pornography not just to individual harm, but to these bigger systemic issues of power and violence against women.
Okay.
A core idea from radical feminism, for example, is that porn isn't just reflecting power imbalances, it's actively producing them. It shapes how society sees women as sort of subordinate, sexually available for men.
So it reinforces harmful attitudes.
That's the argument, that this normalization of objectification contributes to a culture where violence against women, like rape and sexual harassment, is more likely to happen, or at least be tolerated.
And there were specific figures associated with this.
Oh, yes. Andrea Dworkin was a really central voice here. She even pushed for legal strategies like the Anti-Pornography Civil Rights Ordinance, trying to frame porn as a form of sex discrimination.
Wow.
And more recently, you have people like Gail Dines and her group, Culture Reframed, doing educational work, raising awareness about the harms they see linked to pornography.
But then there's a completely different feminist take, isn't there? Worried about censorship, freedom of speech.
Exactly. That's the other side of the coin within feminism. Many feminists see trying to ban or censor porn as a really dangerous slope.
How so?
Well, the fear is that those same tools could eventually be used to shut down other kinds of expression, maybe even expression about sexuality that feminists themselves value.
Right, unintended consequences.
Precisely. Figures like Betty Friedan, Kate Millett, while they certainly critiqued gender roles, they were wary of teaming up with conservatives on anti-porn campaigns. They worried it could undermine broader feminist goals like sexual liberation and equality. Then you also have sex-positive feminists. They argue that ethical, empowering porn is possible. Porn that celebrates female sexuality without objectifying or coercing anyone.
So they see potential for good pornography.
Some do, and some argue that if participation is consensual among adults, then how someone interprets an act, whether they see it as humiliating, is subjective and doesn't automatically make the content problematic.
It really shows the deep debates within feminism itself on this.
Absolutely. Huge complexities around sexuality, gender, power, and how best to tackle the issues.
It seems like some of those feminist concerns, though, especially about harm to women, actually overlap with conservative views.
That's a really key intersection, yeah. Religious conservatives often find themselves agreeing with certain anti-porn feminists about the potential degradation and objectification they see in porn.
Even if their reasons are different.
Even if their starting points, theology versus, say, social justice, are quite different. For conservatives, a really big consistent worry is the threat porn poses to children.
Right, access and influence.
Exactly. Both accessing it and how it might shape their understanding of sex and relationships as they grow up. Plus, some conservative religious groups oppose it because they feel it undermines traditional values.
How so?
By encouraging sex outside of marriage, which they might link to other issues like non-procreative sex, maybe abortion, or the spread of STDs.
And there are specific organizations that focus on this, like Concerned Women for America.
Yeah, CWA is a good example. While they have a wider conservative agenda, they often bring up pornography when talking about violence against women.
Okay.
Their argument is that widespread consumption can desensitize men, lead to disrespect towards women, especially wives, and ultimately weaken the traditional family structure.
And it's interesting how those arguments sometimes sound quite similar to the anti-porn feminist ones.
It really is. It shows that unexpected alignment we mentioned earlier. Of course, we should also acknowledge, as our sources do, that sadly some extremist elements, often on the far right, have issued violent threats against people in the porn industry, which is just completely unacceptable.
Absolutely. Okay, let's pivot now to the scientific views. This seems like an area with a lot of ongoing research and maybe some conflicting findings.
That's a fair assessment. It's definitely an active area of study.
The work of Dolph Zillman from the 80s often comes up. He seemed to suggest some pretty significant negative effects from watching pornography.
Yes. Zillman's research back then did propose that long-term exposure could lead to what he called unfavorable political effects.
Such as?
Things like potentially less respect for monogamy, maybe a reduced desire to have children. His reasoning was that porn scenarios often lack that emotional intimacy, commitment, the relational stuff usually tied to those life choices.
Okay, I see the logic.
And his 1982 study also suggested a possible link between watching porn and becoming desensitized to victims of sexual violence.
How do they measure that?
In his study, people who'd viewed porn recommended lighter sentences for convicted rapists. Based on that kind of work, some researchers, like Zillman himself, argued that porn harms society, maybe even contributes to sexual violence rates.
But the scientific community isn't unanimous on that, is it?
No, definitely not. That's crucial to understand. Other researchers have really questioned a direct causal link between just watching porn and committing sexual violence.
Okay.
Some studies have even found correlations going the other way, like higher porn consumption correlating with decreased sex crimes in some areas. But establishing clear cause and effect there is really, really difficult and debated.
So it's not a settled issue.
Far from it. Mainstream science generally doesn't claim porn directly causes rape. It's much more complex. And you hear that phrase, pornification of America, right?
Yeah.
That points to how much more visible and accessible explicit content is now, but the actual impact of that trend is, again, really debated by researchers and the public alike.
What about more recent studies? We saw a reference to a 2021 review that sounded a bit more nuanced.
Yes, the Hoagland and Grubbs review. That one's interesting because it makes a key distinction.
Which
They found that just general porn use, what they called mere use, often wasn't linked to sexual functioning problems, positive or negative.
Okay.
But when people self-reported their use as problematic-like, they felt distressed by it or felt it was negatively impacting their lives that was consistently linked to more sexual functioning issues.
So it's more about the individual's relationship with it, how they perceive it.
Exactly. It highlights that maybe we need to look beyond just if someone watches it and more at the context and their subjective experience. And the impact also seems to vary a lot among teenagers, depending on personality, other risk factors.
Right, so it's definitely not one size fits all, especially for younger people.
Precisely. Research suggests teens who watch a lot of porn, especially if they're seeking out violent stuff, or if they already have other issues like mental health struggles or family problems, they might be more vulnerable.
Okay.
For instance, some studies link more frequent use in male adolescents, particularly those who are, say, sensation-seeking or have family issues with more permissive sexual attitudes, stronger gender stereotypes.
And potentially other behaviors.
Potentially, yeah, correlations with earlier sexual activity or even aggression. But, and this is really important, researchers are usually careful to present these as correlations, as suggestions. The exact impact on a developing teenage brain is still being studied. It's not like a proven fact.
Got it. Another connection we often hear about is between pornography and rape culture. How does that argument work?
Well, the argument centers on the idea that certain types of porn, especially content showing non-consensual acts or degrading women, objectifying them, might contribute to this broader thing called rape culture.
And rape culture is.
Sociologically, it describes a society where attitudes and beliefs tend to normalize or even excuse sexual violence. Think victim blaming, trivializing assault, pervasive objectification of women.
Okay.
Critics argue that some porn reinforces and perpetuates those very attitudes, and the fact that search terms like rape scenes are apparently quite common on porn sites is often pointed to as, well, potential evidence of this link.
It was quite striking to see Pamela Anderson and Rabbi Shmuley Boteach team up on this, calling online porn a public hazard.
Yeah, that got a lot of attention. Their 2016 Wall Street Journal piece called it a public hazard of unprecedented seriousness.
Quite strong language.
Very. And they called for a sensual revolution, basically, shifting focus back to human connection, love, personality, real relationships, rather than what they see as the isolating, dehumanizing effects of online porn.
And they've continued that advocacy.
They have. Joint lectures, including one at Oxford, a book called Lust for Love, really pushing for a rethink of intimacy and sex in our digital world.
The potential neurological effects on kids and teens.
Yeah.
That's a huge concern for many, but you mentioned it's hard to research directly.
Extremely hard, yes. Ethically, it's a minefield. While there's discussion about young brains maybe being more vulnerable, you can't exactly conduct studies that deliberately expose minors to potentially harmful content.
Right, of course not.
Rory Reed at UCLA made that point. Universities just won't do studies like that. It's unethical. Interestingly, Some surveys looking at porn use and teen mental health found a kind of U-shaped curve,
Yeah.
meaning that both very low and very high levels of use seemed potentially linked with some mental health issues. But
Yeah.
again, that's correlation from a survey, not proof of cause and effect.
Okay. And finally, what about porn addiction? Is that an officially recognized thing?
That's a really important clarification. The medical and psychiatric fields are quite specific here.
Yeah, so.
While the World Health Organization in the ICD-11 does recognize something called compulsive sexual behavior disorder, or CSBD,
Okay.
it lists it as an impulse control disorder, not as an addiction, like a substance addiction.
Okay. Favorite category.
Exactly. And the American Psychiatric Association's manual, the DSM-5, and its update, the DSM-5-TR, they don't classify compulsive porn use as a distinct mental disorder or behavioral addiction at all.
So the idea of a porn addiction isn't medically established in the same way.
Not in those official classifications, no. And experts like Emily Rothman have said the wider public health community generally doesn't back declaring porn a public health crisis based on current science. Some even see the arguments for that crisis as, well, pseudoscientific.
Okay. So wrapping up this deep dive,
Yeah.
it's really clear the reasons for opposing pornography are incredibly varied.
Absolutely. So many different threads.
We've touched on religious beliefs about morality, human dignity, feminist concerns about exploitation, potential links to violence, but also those internal feminist debates about censorship, conservative views focused on traditional values protecting kids. And then the scientific perspectives looking at potential effects, but with lots of complexity and disagreement still in the research.
Precisely. And it's so important to remember it's not just one single movement. Even the definition of porn is up for debate, and the motivations behind opposing it are layered, sometimes even conflicting.
So it leaves us with a lot to think about. Here's maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. Considering all these diverse arguments, the religious convictions, the very different feminist takes, the conservative concerns, the evolving science, what do you find most compelling in the opposition to pornography? And what could the implications be for how we act as individuals, how we understand sexuality, and maybe for society overall? It's definitely complex, no easy answers, but hopefully understanding these different viewpoints is a good starting point for thinking it through.